thank you to begin with to the Jaipur Literature Festival for hosting this wonderful event. And thank you, of course, to all of you for showing up on this glorious morning in London. This conversation, in my view, is a particularly timely one. The context to the conversation is Dr. Tharoor's new book, Our Living Constitution. The reason that I think that this conversation is timely is because we have now crossed the 75th year of the functioning of our Constitution. In recent research, it's been revealed that most constitutions don't last for nearly as long as that. Most of them last for about between 15 and 20 years and perish in one way or another. I suspect that many of the framers themselves would not have ventured to guess that the Constitution would have lasted for 75 years in the form that it has. And so one of the great puzzles for us as constitutional thinkers, scholars, is why the Constitution has endured this long. Has it endured this long because of the politicians or despite them? Has it endured this long because of the judges or again despite them? And of course, what role do the people themselves have in the endurance of the Constitution? Can I start then with a question to Dr. Tharoor, which is, what was the single greatest achievement of the framers of the Constitution? And I'm going to posit one theory to you. You may disagree with that. But the example that always comes to mind for me is universal adult franchise. The reason for that is because we take it for granted today. It was not taken for granted in 1947 or 1950. At the time of the Government of India Act, something like 30 million Indians were able to vote. I think that was around 30% of the adult population. That, in my view, was an audacious experiment. Do you agree that that was the greatest achievement, or do you have a different view?
No, I mean, first of all, I agree that was a major achievement. Don't forget that some of the more well-established democracies, I mean, Britain had only given women the vote a couple of decades earlier, and the United States were yet fully to give blacks the vote until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So when you think about it, a universal adult franchise was a stunning and bold experiment. Many people sneered at it in the West, saying that if in many countries, the Swiss, I think, again, gave women the vote only in 1978. So, I mean, you really have to understand that this was not something that the world took for granted in 1947, and Chintan is quite right in pointing to it. But I would go to a different example. I think the most remarkable achievement, and we could debate this endlessly because there's so many remarkable achievements, was probably the constitution of the individual as an autonomous actor in determining his or her own political destiny for the first time. Because till the Constitution, Indians had been conceived of not as individuals, not as citizens, but as members of communities. Even the Government of India in 1935 essentially created a confederation of communities with Muslims voting for Muslims and that sort of thing. The way in which your political identity was constituted was through your communal identity or your regional identity. If you belong to a princely state, your rights were different from if you belong to a British presidency. Your gender was a factor. Your education levels were a factor. That 30 million was because there were tests for your education qualifications, literacy, ownership of property, and so on, before you were entitled to vote. Suddenly, every individual as an individual was constituted as a citizen. And to my mind, that and the inherent idea that each individual was therefore free of any pre-established allegiances derived from their birth, from their identity as a member of a religious community, that they were free of the obligations coming from that and could make their own political choices. That was a far more radical idea than I think people are allowing for, because it constituted a new political imagination in the idea of the average Indian citizen.
Mukulika, can I put the same question to you? Because I'm curious about whether you agree with us, whether you agree with the developed Dr. Tharoor version of the greatest achievement, or whether you have something different in mind.
I don't think Dr. Tharoor's version is that different from what you're saying, because by giving every individual citizen the vote without question, you're taking them seriously as individuals, right?
But you're also abolishing communal electorates, for example.
Yes. What one would add to that, though, is that there is a huge burden that democracy has when the Indian Constitution is formed as well, because you can imagine the individual as an individual citizen, regardless of any community ties, and yet there is this great burden of caste and social justice that needs to be addressed. So there are also provisions in the Constitution, which is about redressing historical injustice, which are brought in alongside. Right? So you're addressing community-based historical injustice, which is basically caste, alongside individual rights and the right to vote as a foundational right. The second thing, if I may say, Chintan, is that, you know, when you think, I work on democracy, thinking about democratic theory, there is a radical imagination to the Indian Constitution in how you think about democracy. Not just as a set of institutions and institutional structures and procedures of parliament and free media and, you know, all the checklist aspects of democracy. But India is also constituted in the Constitution as a democratic republic, right? Which puts a huge importance on what kind of relationship individuals will have amongst themselves. So you don't just have rights about electing your representatives, but you also have inbuilt ideals about associated living, right? Which is captured in the word republic, which Dr. Ambedkar absolutely insisted on. He was singular in insisting on that insertion of calling India a republic, not just because it had got rid of the monarchy, but because it was a Republican concept of citizenship. But more later. Yeah.
And if I could just compliment what Mukulika said, Ambedkar also insisted on the notion of fraternity.
Yes.
Liberty and equality were all fine as concepts, and he obviously stood by them. But he said that precisely for the reason of caste. Are we each other's brothers and sisters, really? Or are we differentiating amongst ourselves on the basis of caste hierarchies? And that's why fraternity was so important to him. So that too, I think, complements what Mukulika has just said.
Yes, yes. And since we've started talking about the preamble is, of course, the opening chapter of a very long novel. So I do want to come to the length of the Constitution. Just to set the scene here, the Constitution was, at its inception, 395 articles, 8 schedules, now 450 or so articles, 12 schedules. The American Constitution, by contrast, is about 4,000 words long, I think you've said in your book. And there's a bit of a paradox here, isn't it? Because the longer a document is, any document, if it's a set of terms and conditions that you have on an app that you've downloaded on your phone, the less likely a person is to read the document. So I would venture to say that most Indians have not, in their lifetime, read the Constitution cover to cover.
My publishers are banking on that. That's why they might read my book instead.
My question to both of you is, does that matter?
I don't think it matters at all. It's like a 20-page contract when you buy a microwave. You don't read it, but you're reassured that it's there and your lawyer will read it and it's there and you signed it and you read the preamble, so to speak, the summary of the core ideas. I don't think it matters. But I think what is worth saying is that because you're raising the issue of engagement with the Constitution, there was we talk about it much less. When the Constitution is being written, the Constituent Assembly is working, up until November 49, there were all these briefings and consultations being held with ordinary Indians who are petitioning ideas, who are giving feedback to the Constituent Assembly about what they want in the Constitution. And when the Constitution is adopted in those early years, there is a whole series of very unexpected engagements with the Constitution. All kinds of people are using it to fight their own battles. So there is a sense of ownership and engagement that I think historically, empirically we have, which is far greater than actually sitting down and reading boring documents that lawyers like you do.
Mukulika, can I push back against that a little bit?
Against the boring bit, yeah, sure.
Well, against the analogy with the microwave. A constitution is of greater significance than a microwave manual. And one would hope that in the exercise of civic education, it is possible to explain what the contents of the Constitution are in a relatively simple and concise way.
By Shashi Tharoor's book.
Yeah. There you are. Thank you, Mukulika.
Because that's what this is, really.
That's what it's trying to be.
Yeah. Yes.
But let me add, because I agree 100% with Mukulika, so I won't waste time elaborating what she said. I heard the wonderful anecdote of an illiterate woman who could read, therefore, nothing,
yes,
including the Constitution, swearing by the Constitution and saying, this is what gives me my rights to demand X from the sarpanch of the village. I have the right under the Constitution to ask you this or to demand this. Now, that sense has been instilled in the general populace of India.
And can I just link to that is the question of amendment. It's another topic that you deal with in your book, Dr. Tharoor. Yeah. The Indian Constitution is a frequently amended document. It's been amended on average more than once a year.
Over 100 amendments, yeah.
Over 100 amendments, 75 years. Much less, again, than its American counterpart. Have we struck the right balance between stability and flexibility? And the second, perhaps slightly more difficult question is, do we deny sufficient credit to those that have worked the Constitution? So we describe, Nehru and Patel, Ambedkar and so on as the founding fathers or the women, the founding mothers or the framers. But we describe the likes of Dr. Manmohan Singh or Vajpayee as politicians. And are we being unfair to them? Because they have actually worked the Constitution. They've brought in many of these amendments. And so should they themselves be seen as framers of the Constitution?
It's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, we always think of the original founders of any institution, club, or drafters of a document as the framers, and the others as people who kept it going. I mean, every club, the World Test Championship final is coming to a close soon, and you can't say that those who have graced the game for the last 200 years haven't made it, yes, even if they didn't found it or establish it or create the grounding. So I think you made a very valid point. Let's give these folks credit as well. But I still think that basic conception, the choices made, for example, presidential system versus parliamentary, I would have personally plumped for the presidential, so would Ambedkar, but they gave in eventually to the wishes. What often happens when you've been denied something by a bunch of colonizers is you think, if they won't give it to you, it must be worth having. And therefore, the British have denied us parliamentary democracy. Let's have parliamentary democracy, I think was implicit at the back of the minds of many of those who insisted on that. But anyway, those choices have still laid down the ground rules. And thereafter, yes, Ambedkar's famous speech on November 25, 1949, when he said that however good the Constitution is, if those who happen to work it are a bad lot, it'll be a bad Constitution. And however bad the Constitution may be, if those who happen to work it turn out to be a good lot, it'll be a good Constitution. And that, therefore, even in the founding moment, yes, acknowledges the role of those who have to make the thing work. Right. So your question is entirely reasonable. But on the frequency of amendments, I don't think that's a weakness of the Constitution. I think it's a strength. I think, number one, it gives you that adaptability, which has been what has enabled it to last 75 years, because if you have a document so inflexible that it cannot survive the stresses and strains that come up in a fractious democratic polity, it would have collapsed. And like many other, I think the Pakistanis have had 5 or 6 constitutions in the same period that we've had one. So I think the adaptability, which was foreseen by Ambedkar and the others as something that was inherently part of the Constitution. This is not a document cast in stone. Future generations will have the opportunity to change it, and they did, and that's fine. And because of that adaptability, think of the number of things that have happened that weren't envisaged. Let's face it, Ambedkar was a massive critic of the whole idea of village self-governance.
Yes.
It took us, therefore, 40 years for Panchayati Raj to come into the Constitution. But it's done now, and though it works unevenly in different states, in many places it has empowered the grassroots in ways that perhaps Ambedkar would not have envisaged back in the 1940s. So yes, these amendments, I believe, have been very important, have been transformative. I've also brought in rights that go beyond the fundamental rights of the Constitution, the right to education, for example, or the right to information, or the right to paid employment for the rural poor, all of these things which have come in through constitutional amendments. So I'm not at all a critic of the fact that the thing has been amended so much. I think it actually reveals the strength, the flexibility, the adaptability, and the capacity for absorption of new currents, new political currents, new social currents that have made the Constitution a living document.
Mukulika, do you have something to add?
If I may, in many ways I agree 100%. And this adaptability and responsiveness to political events was also happening actually between 47 and 49. If you think about it, that while the Constitution is being written, partition violences happened. The largest land rights movement, the Telangana movement, has happened. The largest labor strike has happened. There have been student protests. There is a sense in which the political is shaping the legal and the constitutional as it's being written. And what you're describing is really a continuation of that process where absolutely that political is present in the legal and constitutional, where the rights that you mentioned have come about through politics on the ground, which goes back to, what kind of living constitution is this? That people own it and exercise those rights and ask for more rights. And they're coming out of social movements and electoral politics maybe, but certainly social movements, which in their turn then affect representatives in parliament like you to debate and change things. So the political and the legal and constitutional have always worked together.
Mukulika, can I come to you with a slightly different question, which is that we often celebrate the achievements of the framers of our Constitution, but we see the failings discussed much less. And I can almost understand that in the early years after the Constitution is enacted, because there is a sense that one needs to give this thing some legitimacy and you focus on the achievements. But I think we are now perhaps at a stage where we also need to focus more on the failings and what went wrong when the Constitution was being framed. And I certainly had one thing in mind, for example, which is that our chapter on fundamental rights contained at its inception and still contains a draconian regime for preventive detention, which in some respects was even more draconian than the colonial regime that preceded it. So, for example, it provides for detention and representations to be made to an advisory board without access to a lawyer, which is a very basic right in my view. What, in your view, are the greatest failings of the Constituent Assembly?
I'm not a legal scholar, so I won't go into that, except to say that, frankly, if I was in the opposition, I'm listening.
Go ahead.
What we have
permanently in opposition, sir.
Well, it might not be so permanent. We have to live in hope. Is that it is true, just like you said, there are a whole series of laws which exist in the Constitution which simply should not be there. And a lot of, when we find things wrong, they're not illegal, they're not unconstitutional, they're just a very effective way of using laws that exist. And really what we need in contemporary India is a list of those laws and serious discussion and revocation of those to make a truly modern and progressive constitution.
Yes.
Yeah, I was troubled by the fact that we sort of persisted with the penal code that the British had inflicted upon us. The sedition law could have been done away with, considering that the biggest victims of it were the very nationalists in whose name the freedom struggle was waged. The British got rid of it in the 70s, and we have only finally abolished it under that name, but while restoring much of the the concept behind it in this new Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. So I'm not terribly happy about the fact that some of these things, see, don't forget they were influenced by the horrors they were seeing around them. There was no law and order for large chunks. I mean, you had trainfuls of dead bodies arriving across the border, right? You had people having homes destroyed, billions of rupees of property damaged, lives lost, at least 1 million, 13 million people displaced. And so I think you could understand why the framers at that time felt it necessary to preserve some of this draconian legislation in order to be able to curb the worst excesses of the looters, the killers, the rampagers, etc. But why thereafter, as peace, stability, and so on dawned, a more stable constitutional period did not abolish these things is a fair question to ask, and I think they should have been gotten rid of. Yeah.
I would like to discuss the constitutional challenges of the moment, moving on from history. But I do have one question for you, Dr. Tharoor, on your book and the title of your book, Our Living Constitution. It's a very interesting title because it's almost strange to think of a document or a book as a living thing, isn't it? A book is something that's written at a particular point in time and then read by people over successive generations, perhaps. What is it that makes the Constitution a living thing? Rather than a novel that's written in 1945 and that is consumed for the next 100 years?
Because it's continuing to sort of breathe and move and change with time. We talked about the amendments, I won't repeat that. But even, for example, judicial interpretations. Who would have thought in the 1940s or 50s that you would find a right to privacy in the existing language of the Constitution? Yeah. That's what makes it living. You are seeing this Constitution through different prisms in later eras with the sensibilities of a later time and finding encoded in it the possibility of giving you new rights and new ways of looking at things. Judicial judgments, I think, vastly expanded the scope of women's freedoms in India throughout the 1990s, for example, which were implicit in the Constitution but not made explicit in the era of the 1940s. Yeah. So that's what I think makes it living. It's not just the amendments, it's also the judicial interpretations and the applications of it over time.
Yes. And this is particularly a question for the lawyers in the audience, but one of those judicial interpretations was a series of judgments which in effect enabled the Supreme Court to make appointments, to arrogate the process of appointments unto to themselves through the collegium system. One of the few things on which your party and the party in majority have been able to agree over the last 10 years was the
I actually am a dissenter on that. I don't agree with either party.
Yes. So in fact, that was going to be my question. If we do have, so the NJAC Act was from 2015. Yeah. As you know, it was struck down by the Supreme Court. If we do have either that or a modified version of the NJAC Act in 2027, what would Dr. Tharoor have to say about it?
I would be interested in ensuring that whatever it was did not add to the overweening power of the executive. Because we've already got a situation, which is an inherent flaw in the parliamentary system, that the legislature, after the election, becomes subordinate to the executive. In fact, it serves for the most part as either a notice board or a rubber stamp to the executive. Yes. Once the executive has a majority, and the anti-defection law has made things worse with the inability to dissent from your own parties or your own government stand without losing your seat. Very different from the way the British parliamentary system works, where you even had ministers in the cabinet disagreeing with the prime minister's wish to go to war in Iraq and having an open debate about that in parliament. Impossible in India, right? So already of the three branches of government, two are essentially subordinate to the will of the ruling party. Now, if you create therefore a process where the judiciary is also appointed by the parliamentary majority, then you're toast. Yeah. You essentially end up with a recipe for one-party rule and across the three branches of government. So though I completely agree that conceptually it's deeply flawed. We, I think, are the only judiciary in the world that appoints itself and renews itself. Every other country, there is a voice for the legislature, but those are more independent legislatures than the parliamentary system permits us to have. And therefore, for me, the problem with a judicial accountability to the parliament is that essentially it means giving the keys to the judiciary to the hands of the executive. So ideally, I'm an old stalwart of the Montesquieu school, you know. You really need three completely separate branches of government that are unable, in my view, to actually control each other. And that's the best way to preserve democracy. We don't have that already because two of the branches are really one.
Yes.
And on top of that, and that's one of the great flaws of the parliamentary system, yes, which I've objected for 30 odd years in writing. I prefer the presidential, not because I want to see a strong man ruling India, but rather because I want an executive accountable to a legislature which is completely free of controlling or controlled by the executive. And that's a totally different argument for the presidential system. But in this system we have, for God's sake, at least let's keep the judges free.
Right. Mukulika, Dr. Tharoor touched on a subject which I wanted to discuss with you, which is the gulf between electoral democracy and deliberative democracy. Now, I think you'd agree with me that we should, to some extent, be congratulating ourselves that we do electoral democracy very well. Because at least in my view, you can't have deliberative democracy unless you have electoral democracy. One is necessary, the other is sufficient, as it were. How does one bridge that gulf over the next 10 or 15 years? I mean, we've heard this criticism for a long, long time. We do process very well, but we tend not to hold those in power accountable between elections.
And that's exactly why Ambedkar put in that word, republic, because it indicates the importance of what he would call active citizenship, that every one of us has a job to do. You don't just go and vote and then sit back for 5 years and expect the world to get better. You've got to hold their feet to the fire every single day. Deliberative, when you say deliberative democracy, Chintan, you're presumably thinking of the parliament and the legislature, but deliberation happens in ordinary spaces, in village squares, amongst people at homes and in schools and universities, when they're allowed to do it, not always. Another disclaimer you're absolutely right. I would agree 100% with you 10 years ago that I think we did do process very well in India, which is why I wrote the book, Why India Votes, and people vote in great numbers. I don't think the integrity of the electoral system is what it used to be in India before 2014, and I've said this in print, and I won't go into this further. But I think your question is so interesting, Chintan, because in the 2024 elections, we were here a year ago at JLF, just after the national elections had concluded in India, and the 2024 elections was actually a very good coming together of the constitution and electoral democracy, where all across India, and in certain pockets particularly, the constitution became the rallying cry of saving the country. People have traditionally worshipped the Constitution. There are temples built to the Constitution, etc., to go back to your earlier question. But last year, there was a real sense, and the opposition built on this, that the ideals of the preamble and the very integrity of the Indian Constitution were under threat. And this was enough to mobilize people to get out, vote, and vote to ensure that these changes did not happen. And we saw that coming together. Yes. And at the end of the day, unless it becomes an electoral issue like that, yes, it's not going to have the purchase it needs. Yeah.
I do want to come to the audience for questions, but just before that, I have one final question for you, Dr. Tharoor, which is that most people operate under the assumption that the Indian Constitution in its present form goes hand in hand with the Indian state. So long as the state exists, the Constitution will exist. And one will only fall away if the other falls away. Is that presumption correct? I mean, you have mentioned in your answer that you would support a presidential form of government. That, in my view, could not be done within the existing constitutional regime. So it can't be done by constitutional amendment. It can only be done by an act of constitutional replacement, using a new constituent assembly. Is there any situation in which it would be legitimate to establish a new constituent assembly and write a new constitution?
Actually, no. Even though I've said that I would have preferred that, and I think it's a theoretical argument one can make ad infinitum, I I fully understand, number one, it's not going to happen.
Yes.
Because everyone knows and works the system they now have. So there is zero support for the idea of changing. And because, as I said, the constitution we have has given us enough flexibility and adaptability to accommodate pretty much everything short of a fundamental alteration, I would rather not go that route. It's very interesting that, when the BJP came to power for the first time with a full majority, that is 2014, not the Vajpayee victories, he had to depend on massive support from other parties who didn't share much of his party's manifesto agenda. But in 2014, the BJP did, and there was a lot of talk that they were going to scrap the constitution. Many of you are aware, I'm sure, that there were alternative constitutions being mooted at the time of our the Hindu Mahasabha came up with a draft. There was also Deen Dayal Upadhyay's very detailed critique of the constitution. They all wanted a very different kind of document. And it was said, it was in fact reported, so not just rumored, that an RSS ideologue called Mr. Govindacharya was actually busy writing a new constitution, which was going to be presented before the end of the first term of the BJP. Strikingly, that never happened. And now there is no talk of that anymore. This is the government that is celebrating the constitution. The Prime Minister, first of all, gives away the copies of it as his holy book, though he also gives the Bhagavad Gita. No, I've got mentioned that. I'm just saying. But he does say this is my holy book. Second, this is the government that actually has decided to commemorate for the first time in India's political history the adoption day of not the formal adoption, 26 January, but the conclusion of the debates in the Constituent Assembly on November 26th is now called Samvidhan Divas, or Constitution Day, and there is a commemorative debate in Parliament. And on top of that, the big 75th anniversary and so on. So I think it's very clear that this constitution is now safe, even from the political airs of its biggest critics. So I think given that the Constitution is therefore so much beyond the purview of debate, I think even my own objection is essentially an academic one. I would rather we kept the Constitution we have, since it has so much allegiance across the political spectrum, work it to the best of our ability, strengthen it where we can. Remember, I think, some of the great imprecations of the founders, that, for example, there are some rights that cannot be derogated even by a legislative majority, that a majority alone does not allow you to tamper with the rights of individual Indian citizens. If some of those things are fully understood and respected by all, then this constitution should not, in my view, deserve any further cavil or change.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I might turn to the audience then. For questions. If you do have a question, could you please raise your hand? We might actually take 2 or 3 questions together so we can get a few in.
There's so many hands.
We have none.
Yeah, okay, that's great. So if you could just go to the back. Yes, if we can start at the back, right at the very back. There are 3 or 4 questions just there. And if we can have questions rather than speeches, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
I'll try to make it very, very short. Thank you for the conversation. Unfortunately, part of living constitutions is also the group of laws that provide for presidential rule or emergency legislations in case of emergencies. And this is part of the Indian constitutions, is part of many other constitutions. At the moment, with the crumbling of democracy, this is the case in the US with President Trump, is also the case in Italy with Prime Minister Meloni. In India, it's a story of the past because it was true at the time of Indira Gandhi. Do you see that risk arising back in India? And if not, why?
So do you see that risk? We can hold that.
Yes. We'll take a couple of more questions, yes.
You touched on the nature of the Indian constitutional amendments in relation to the relative lack of amendments made to the US Constitution. In this time of ultimate American political turmoil, with some citing a possible constitutional crisis in the US on the horizon, is there anything the Americans can learn from the way that India has gone about its constitution in the last 75 years?
What can Americans learn?
Okay, we'll take one more question.
One more?
Mr. Tharoor, you just said that the Constitution is safe now, it's in safe hands. I wanted to refer to the preamble, and in the preamble we have the sovereign, secular, democratic republic. Is secular really the case?
Okay, so 3 questions. Emergency, what the Americans can learn from the Indians, as it were, and the question about the preamble.
Right. Okay. So on the question of emergency provisions, I think again the founders were also strongly influenced, not just by the fact that those provisions existed in the British Government of India Act 1935, but by the conditions prevailing at the time of the Constituent Assembly. They felt there would be a need for that kind of authority to be available. As you know, it was applied quite appropriately during wars and quite inappropriately between 1975 and 1977, at the end of which the 44th Amendment essentially has made it impossible to do that again. And so you've seen the Constitution both being applied rightly, applied wrongly, and then being rectified to prevent wrong application. To my mind, that suggests that this has worked well, in that we've learned from to use Ambedkar's phrase, if people misuse or run the Constitution badly, then clearly that can be changed and needs to be changed. On what the Americans can learn from us, I think the problem the poor Americans have is they have a two-party system. In our case, we have 41 parties in the Lok Sabha. So imagine there'll never be sort of gridlock between two parties in India, because we will never be content with merely two parties. Our various interests will be represented in such a multiplicity of voices. But the other thing, of course, is the American system is presidential, ours is parliamentary, and so you can't really directly apply lessons from one to the other than to say that one thing in common is that the way in which a constitution is applied, the temperament of those who exercise authority in applying it, can always make a difference the way in which it affects the well-being of ordinary citizens. We've seen that in our country. I think the Americans are seeing it now, and I should probably leave it there. The third one about the preamble. You know, the preamble did not contain initially the word secular and socialist, because though this was proposed and was discussed, Ambedkar rejected socialist on the grounds that it was up to, he himself was a socialist, but he wanted future governments to be free, not to be socialist, as it were, so he didn't accept that socialism had to be put into the Constitution. And he didn't agree with secular, not because he disagreed with secularism, but because he felt it was so implicit throughout the Constitution that the word didn't need to be used. After all, if you look at that whole panoply of articles that gives you the freedom of religion, the freedom of worship, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to propagate your own religion, all of that, those implicitly guarantee secularity, because the state very clearly cannot privilege one faith over the others without being in violation of those articles. And therefore the argument was that the Constitution was secular anyway. Now, in the 42nd Amendment in 1976, they wrote those two words into the preamble. And when the 44th undid much of the 42nd, it didn't take these two words out, it left them there. And that was again a very conscious choice by the Parliament of the day that had been elected in opposition to the emergency during which these changes were made. So it seemed to be a national consensus. Well, there was again a debate over it. Some in the current ruling dispensation wanted to drop the word secular, and socialist for that matter, but particularly secular, because they felt that it was not appropriate in the Indian context. And the matter went all the way to the courts again, as everything does in India eventually. And the court said that they didn't want to rule on the matter because, in fact, of the same argument that secularism was built into the social as well as the political and constitutional fabric of the country. So I think that attempt too will not be gaining steam again. I think the preamble remains safe. But we all know that what really matters is not the words in the preamble, it's the way it's applied. And this whole notion of majoritarianism, which is explicitly rejected by the Constitution. Ambedkar again specifically said, be conscious that the majority you're talking about is a communal majority and not a political majority. And be attentive to the rights of the minorities that are guaranteed by the Constitution. Having said that, therefore, one could argue that ultimately the way in which the governments elected by the people of India interpret what secular means will ultimately be more significant for all of us in our daily lives in India than the word's existence or not in the text.
Mukulika, can I just add my 2 cents before inviting you to comment? which is that I have heard quite frequently that the presence or absence of the words socialist and secular in the preamble would make no difference. But I see a certain tension there between that and the argument that you made previously, which is that this is a very long document. It's a lawyer's document. And so most ordinary Indians are in fact going to be reading the preamble and relying on it as a concise and accurate summary of what the Constitution contains. If that must be right, it also must be right that removing those two important words from the summary would have some impact.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Absolutely. And this was evident during the Citizenship Amendment Act protests against it. Everywhere, what were people doing? They were chanting and reading out collectively the preamble. It has the spirit of the law as much as the letter of the law. So I think what you're saying, Shashi, is true, but you can pay lip service to the Constitution by commemorating the day, or you can say that, oh, we are not going to change it. But if the politics that you practice is not secular, then people pick up on it, and that is what happened in 2024 during the elections. That's why the slogan "Samvidhan Khatre mein hai" got such popular appeal, because people felt their constitutional ideals were being threatened. Never mind what was being said. If the politics was not secular, was not equidistant from all religions, this was not acceptable to Indians. And that's what they said in the 24 elections. And Mr. Modi didn't get a majority. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for some more questions. If we can go to the gentleman at the back and then a few others, please.
Yeah, apologies, very simplistic question. So constitutions obviously delineate power within a republic and would involve some sort of enshrining of rights which are difficult to take away. So as an outsider, I simply don't understand how Article 370 could just be overridden and the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir taken away.
Okay, we'll take a couple of other questions.
Hello. Does people really understand the importance of the vote? If they not, I mean, if they yes, why there are, like, sorry to use these words, but why there are corrupt and murderer and rapists still in the power position in India?
Just following on from that question, I just took a few notes. It's always a matter of self-respect that countries have a constitution, although very developed countries do not.
Could you hold that a little closer to your... I'm sorry, I'm losing some of your words.
Sorry. I was just following on from the previous question. I just took some few notes down based on what was said earlier. It's always a matter of self-respect that countries have a constitution, although it must be noted that more developed countries do not. The point I wanted to make is I thought it was going to be provocative, but it's already been said that most people don't read the Constitution. And I take issue with I think it's Ms. Banerjee, who says there's no need to read it. I think there's a great need to read it, and it cannot be compared to a washing machine manual or whatever. The point I'm making is simply this. You have a Constitution, in my view, it's pretty much a paper tiger. I also think with 50 million cases pending and 30% of the politicians having criminal cases pending, just really speaks for itself. Thank you.
Okay, let's take those questions. So we have Article 370. We have the washing machine analogy, which seems to have offended many in the audience, Mukulika. So you may want to address that. And then we have the state of the justice system more generally. So perhaps, Dr. Tharoor.
Well, on Article 370, sir, the thing is, it was actually listed in the Constitution under a heading entitled Temporary Provisions. The idea was never that it would last forever, but that it would be abolished through due process when the time was right and with the consent of all concerned. When I spoke in Parliament against its abolition, my objection was to the procedure and not necessarily the outcome. I felt that by essentially having suspended the elected assembly of Jammu and Kashmir, having your own appointee as governor, then speak for the state in granting the state's consent, and then amending the constitution through your parliamentary majority in Delhi, you were essentially doing an end run around the spirit of the constitution, and that you were also setting a very dangerous precedent that could have been applied, that could still, in theory, be applied to other states. If you can do this to one state whose assembly is suspended under Article 356, then you can do it to every other state. And that's something that I objected to strongly in the Parliament debate. Now, having said that, the actual outcome of the abolition of 370 and the manner in which it has by and large been accepted by the public and the political parties in the state can be found in the subsequent turnout to the elections. And that was the remarkable thing, the fact that for the Lok Sabha elections, we had a 59.8% turnout, which was quite remarkable for Kashmir in recent decades. And then that for the assembly elections, that went up to 64%, suggests that people were eager to seize the opportunity to have their own political destiny back in their hands, elect their own representatives, and move on with the integration that 370 implied. Now, I want to add a personal note there. Even though I opposed the manner in which it was done, I would be amongst those who would concede that the state prospered in recent years. Indeed, I found myself telling Americans how remarkable it was that last year Kashmir had received more tourists than Aspen, Colorado the same year. And that indeed there'd been a further 100% increase in tourism in the first 3 months of this year. Until this horrific terrorist attack, which obviously was designed to undercut Kashmiri prosperity and the Kashmiri economy. So very clearly there were other benefits, but constitutionally I remain unconvinced by the manner in which it was done, and my objections are a matter of parliamentary record. But 370 was a temporary provision, and its abolition is not in itself unconstitutional. It's in fact foreseen in the Constitution.
Mukulika, on the washing machine.
Yeah, I must offer a clarification. I can't have you leaving the room being confused between microwaves and washing machines. Okay, on a serious note. That's serious too, but please understand the spirit in which I was saying what I was saying. It is a long document, as we've heard. It's a legal document. I, as a scholar, will engage with it and read it. Lots of people who need to read the Constitution read it. But there is also a way in which politics works in India, where the spirit of the Constitution is understood, practiced, challenged, and new things are demanded of it. And repeatedly, we have evidence of that, as with the CAA protests or with what happened last year, with anyone even vaguely threatening the preamble and the words that describe the Constitution. There is a mass movement. So there is an understanding of what the Constitution stands for, the spirit of the law. That is critical, and there are actually a lot of Indians who don't. And I would rather that they engaged with that than mandating somehow in some very patronizing way that they should be reading the entire Constitution, which frankly most people are too time poor to be able to do. Thank you.
And I might add, they may not absorb it if they read it. I mean, they need to know what it contains more than the language of the letter of it.
Yeah. Can I just deal with the last question, which is the state of the justice system? I think the difficulty is that we can't both have our cake and eat it too. The Supreme Court, unusually in India, is both the highest appellate court of the land as well as the highest constitutional court. So you have a Supreme Court where, if you were to go and just sit through a day's proceedings in the Supreme Court, I can promise you that much of what you see will not be riveting. It won't be exciting. There will be a teacher who has brought his case all the way up to the Supreme Court fighting for his 10,000 rupee pension, which is a case which is very important to that individual, but may not be a case of constitutional moment. We have, as it stands, made a choice in terms of policy and design that those sorts of cases must be given serious consideration and should be allowed to go to the Supreme Court. And in making that choice, we've naturally made sacrifices, which is that the court will be burdened both with the task of deciding important cases like 370, as well as the cases of the 10,000 rupees of pension for the teacher. I think we have time perhaps for two final questions. We have one on that side, yes.
Yeah, there was this discussion going on about this deliberative and electoral democracy. I have a question that in the current scenario where the deliberative possibilities have shrunk in the sense of opportunity, be it universities, as Mukulika was saying, that it's not there. And definitely the media has, they're just PR agents at the moment. So as a parliamentarian, Dr. Tharoor, can you tell us what kind of suggestions would you have for the, by and large, 1.4 billion Indians? What are the possibilities of a deliberation that can result in an effective electoral decision-making that Mukulika was correctly pointing out about the importance of the Constitution that effectively gave you a different result in 24. How do you see that evolving? Can you just make some suggestions of possibilities of deliberation? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take one final question.
We also have a gentleman over here. Ranaya?
Yeah, okay.
Hi. We're at the British Library and there's a massive gaping hole in the building in terms of, as you will know, we don't have a written or codified constitution in this country famously. So I would like your views on how we do convention here very well or not, and also how some people would describe us as a living constitution. And also, there's always a move for us to have a written and codified constitution amongst certain people. Post-Brexit, that was a massive conversation as well. So I would love your views on that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we have one more question. We'll take that. Okay.
Distinguished panel, a very quick, considered perception that the resilience of our Constitution rests in the brilliant phraseology of Article 368, the amending provision of the Constitution which was further fortified by the Supreme Court judgment. And when the parliaments, both houses, independently amend a Constitution, they transform themselves into a constituent assembly. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start.
Will you tell us for the last question?
Just the amending power. The fact that I can.
Okay, sure. Should I? I think I'll just respond very briefly to the deliberative point. I think it really is important to recognize what you're saying, that a democracy is not just a country that holds regular elections. You've got to have spaces for deliberation and discussion without fear of censure. As an academic who has long-standing and deeply collaborative links with colleagues across Indian universities, it is a real issue of academic freedom, or indeed writing freely in the press, and the kind of censures that one, and there are endless examples of this, which I'm sure you're familiar with. To my mind, the challenge, therefore, really, for anyone, any Indian who cares about the quality of democracy in their country, really needs to take that Ambedkarite idea of active citizenship rather seriously, because I, as an anthropologist, have spent most of my research time in India amongst very illiterate, rural, poor citizens of India who can't write, who cannot read the Constitution, but also know the ways in which you create spaces for discussion. I saw this in West Bengal through the early decades of the century, when the Left Front was a similarly draconian authoritarian regime within West Bengal. And I saw at first hand how people made spaces to reclaim the right to speech or expression. And unless, as an Indian, you value that constitutional right, that cannot be taken away from you. It is a constitutional right. And if people refuse to be scared and continue to speak up and organize collectively, these are not individual heroic battles to be fought. People need to work together, need to to find the ways to express dissent, this battle has to be fought. Thank you.
Last word to Dr. Tharoor.
Well, I think on the deliberation point, there are things that could be done to improve matters procedurally. For example, ours a parliament where every agenda item is determined by the government, and when the opposition clamors for something, the speaker has the right to disallow it. Whereas I think Germany, for example, does have a provision whereby 1 day a week the opposition will set the agenda for that day's discussion. That would remove one of the major causes of the disruption of Parliament, which is something we haven't discussed at all today, which occurs often because the frustration of opposition MPs being unable to raise within the proceedings of Parliament an issue they deem worth discussing and the government would rather not discuss. So that's one procedural thing. I think we have really seen the Speaker to a very great extent finding himself beholden to the legislative majority. And that's something which I think is a challenge because it means, for example, that never is an adjournment motion admitted. In my experience of the last 11 years of BJP rule, and 5 years before that, almost daily adjournment motions are moved and they are routinely rejected, in fact, often in a clump, without any particular reason being given. So that is, again, something which makes it difficult to have debates on pressing matters. But, you know, there is a counter-argument to be made, ma'am, which is that the process of deliberation must lead to a worthwhile outcome. If whatever you decide in debate, the legislative majority has its way, all you'll do is you'll have your say, but they'll have their way. I mean, that's going to be, at the end of it, that's built into the structure of parliamentary democracy, that as long as you have a system which gives you a majority government in a parliamentary system, at least the way it's worked in India, the executive will always prevail. And, you know, the only times of vulnerability have been when fractious coalitions have been in power together, and all you need to do was to persuade one of the parties in the coalition to dissent from the government, and then the whole thing becomes a major issue. That kind of thing has happened very infrequently in Indian politics. So, but, you know, it's a process, it's ongoing. We cannot foresee the behavior of future electorates. I do believe that many, many ways, and even the answer to the other question that was asked, it lies in the increasing political consciousness of the Indian electorate. As our electorate becomes a more educated electorate, and I share Mukulika's respect for the political consciousness of illiterate people, but we're getting to be less and less illiterate, fortunately, and increasingly, that means that the voters will start demanding more of their politicians. They will elect a politician, Desmond Tutu's famous words, you know, stop electing people you're ashamed of. Start electing people you want to be proud of, and you will get results because they themselves will be held by you to a higher standard. And that level of accountability of the elected to the electors will, I think, be what finally guarantees how well the Constitution works in practice. Whether these elected MPs have read every word of the Constitution or not, it's there for them, and they are its custodians, ultimately, along with the judges, who have a very important role in protecting it. I do think that this Constitution is safe as long as it's a living Constitution, as long as it continues to breathe in these wonderful processes of debate, of contention, of social movements, and of thriving political contention that has made India the country it is, and that allows us all to have events like this and think through these matters. I think it's been wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. We are completely out of time.